I never thought I'd fear winter until that night. The cold, the snow, the long dark evenings, they all felt like a cozy embrace once. But after what happened, those quiet nights became a memory I can't escape. Every howl of the wind, every creak of the floorboards. It all takes me back to that one winter break I spent alone in the cabin. It was supposed to be peaceful, a chance to unwind from the stress of college, to have the place all to myself while my family visited relatives out of town. They had asked me to come along, of course, but I thought I needed some solitude. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods, surrounded by towering pines that looked like sentinels guarding the snowy landscape. No neighbors for miles. Just me, the dog, and the stillness of winter. The first few days were uneventful. I'd spend my mornings bundled up in blankets by the fireplace, sipping on hot cocoa and watching the snow fall gently outside the wide glass windows. The view was breathtaking. Pristine white snow covering everything, with sunlight filtering through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. At night, the world seemed even quieter, the kind of silence that pressed down on you. It was almost too quiet. On the third evening, I noticed the stillness was starting to get to me. The cabin, for all its charm, creaked and groaned in the most unsettling ways. It was an old building, and every gust of wind seemed to make it shift on its foundation. The sounds weren't loud, just subtle enough to make me glance over my shoulder. A faint creak in the floorboards here, a groan in the rafters there. It was probably just the cold air settling into the wood. That's what I told myself. Anyway, that night, as I was reading a book in the living room, I felt the first real chill of unease. The dog, an old retriever named Max, lifted his head from the rug and stared at the window. His ears perked up and a low growl rumbled in his chest. I looked up from my book, startled by the sudden change in his demeanor. "What's wrong, boy?" I asked, setting the book aside. Max didn't move. His eyes were locked on the window, his growl growing louder. I got up and peered outside, but all I saw was the snow, soft and untouched, glowing faintly under the moonlight. No footprints, no movement, nothing. "It's just the wind," I said aloud, more to reassure myself than Max. But he didn't seem convinced. He stayed near the window for the rest of the evening, his eyes darting to the shadows outside every now and then. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. It was an emergency weather alert. A blizzard was expected to roll in that night, bringing heavy snowfall and strong winds. It was nothing unusual for this time of year, but the thought of being completely snowed and alone made me a little uneasy. I spent the day preparing, stocking up on firewood, checking the generator, making sure I had enough food and water to last a few days. The cabin was well equipped for situations like this, but there was something about the approaching storm that felt off. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was the way the air outside seemed so still, like the world was holding its breath. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the first flakes of snow began to fall. I stood by the window, watching the storm roll in, the wind picking up and rattling the panes. The snow came fast and heavy, covering the ground in a thick white blanket within hours. By the time night fell, the world outside was completely obscured. The trees that had once stood tall and imposing now looked like faint shadows in the swirling snow. The power flickered once, then twice, before finally cutting out completely. I let out a frustrated sigh and lit a few candles, their warm light casting flickering shadows on the walls. Max stayed close to me, his usual calm demeanor replaced with a quiet unease. I could feel it too, a sense of something lurking just beyond the edges of the light. I tried to keep myself busy, distracting my mind from the growing unease. I played some music on my phone until the battery started to run low. I read a book by candlelight, but I couldn't concentrate. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind against the windows, made my heart race just a little faster. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. I locked the doors, double-checked the windows, and climbed into bed with Max lying at my feet. The wind howled outside, the sound rising and falling like a mournful wail. The creaks and groans of the cabin seemed louder now, almost deliberate, as if the house itself was trying to tell me something. I tried to ignore it, pulling the blankets up to my chin and closing my eyes. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay there in the darkness, listening to the storm rage outside, the sound of the wind like whispers at the edges of my consciousness. I was on the verge of drifting off when I heard it, a soft tapping sound coming from the living room. It was faint at first, barely audible over the storm, but it grew louder, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. My breath caught in my throat as I sat up, straining to hear. Max was already awake, his ears perked up, his eyes fixed on the bedroom door. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, like someone was knocking on the window. I wanted to believe it was just a branch blown loose in the wind, but deep down, I knew better. I got out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest. Max followed me as I crept toward the living room, each step feeling heavier than the last. The cabin was pitch black, the only light coming from the faint glow of the snow outside. As I approached the window, the tapping stopped. I peered out into the darkness, my breath fogging up the glass. The storm was still raging, the snow falling in thick sheets, but there was something else, a shape, just barely visible in the distance. It was tall and thin, standing motionless among the trees, its outline blurred by the snow. My pulse quickened as I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the shape was gone. The storm raged on outside, the wind whipping through the trees and rattling the cabin's windows. I tried to convince myself that the figure I thought I saw was just a trick of the swirling snow. The mind has a way of playing tricks on you, especially when you're alone in the dark. But the unease didn't go away. That night, the strange occurrences began. It started with the tapping. At first, I thought it was just the wind pushing tree branches against the windows. I tried to ignore it, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Tap, pause, tap, tap. It seemed to move from one side of the cabin to the other, like someone or something was circling the house. Max growled low in his throat, his gaze fixed on the far corner of the living room. His hackles were up, his body tense. My chest tightened as I followed his gaze, but the corner was empty, just shadows flickering against the walls, cast by the dancing flames of the fireplace. "It's nothing, Max," I whispered, though my voice betrayed me. As the hours stretched on, the cabin grew colder, despite the roaring fire. The lights began to flicker, not just once, but repeatedly, almost in a pattern. It didn't make sense. The power was out entirely. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the light fixtures, but there was nothing unusual. I didn't think, I just moved. Grabbing Max by the collar, I crept toward the closet in the hallway. It was small and cramped, but it was the only place I could think to hide. I slipped inside, pulling the door shut as quietly as I could. The sound of footsteps echoed through the cabin, slow and deliberate, each one making my heart pound harder. I crouched low, clutching Max to keep him quiet, though he continued to growl softly under his breath. Through the thin slats of the closet door, I could see a beam of light sweeping across the living room. A shadowy figure moved into view, their flashlight casting long, eerie shapes on the walls. They were tall, bundled in a heavy coat, and their movements were methodical, as if they were searching for something or someone. The figure stopped in front of the fireplace, their head tilting as they studied the room. My breath hitched as they turned toward the hallway, the flashlight beam growing closer and closer. I held my breath, every second feeling like an eternity. Max pressed against me, his body trembling as the intruder's shadow stretched across the closet door. They paused just outside the closet. I bit down on my lip, stifling a gasp as the doorknob jiggled slightly. But instead of opening it, the figure moved on, their footsteps fading as they continued to search the cabin. This was my chance. I waited until the light disappeared into another room before I slowly opened the closet door. The cold air rushed in, but I didn't have time to worry about it. Keeping low, I made my way to the kitchen, wincing as every floorboard seemed to groan under my weight. The kitchen window was my only escape. It was small and would be a tight fit, but I had no other choice. I unlocked it as quietly as I could, pushing it open and letting the icy wind whip through the room. With one last glance over my shoulder, I climbed onto the counter and squeezed through the window, landing in the snow below with a muffled thud. Pain shot through my ankle as I hit the ground, and I bit back a cry. Something had twisted or snapped. I couldn't tell which, but there was no time to check. I could see the dark shape of the intruder through the window, their flashlight sweeping the kitchen where I had just been. Using the fire poker for support, I stumbled into the woods, the snow crunching loudly beneath my feet. The cold bit into my skin, my breath coming out in ragged puffs as I pushed myself forward, my injured ankle screaming in protest. Behind me, I heard the faint sound of the back door creaking open again. They knew I was gone, and they were coming after me. The forest stretched endlessly before me, a maze of shadows and snow. My ankle throbbed with each step, and my breath came in sharp, shallow gasps, but I couldn't stop moving. Behind me, the faint sound of footsteps crunched in the snow, measured and unrelenting. They were following me. The car was empty, its doors unlocked, but inside was something that turned my blood to ice. Scattered across the passenger seat were photographs of me. There I was, sitting by the cabin's fireplace, walking Max outside, even unloading groceries from my car. Each photo was taken from a distance, through windows or between trees. Some were time-stamped, going back over a week. They had been watching me the whole time. My hands trembled as I sifted through the photos, my mind racing. This wasn't random. Whoever was in the cabin now had been planning this for days, maybe longer. Footprints, several of them, led from the trees to the cabin. I hadn't made those. My stomach churned as I followed the trail with my eyes. The prints converged at the front porch, where the door stood slightly ajar, its frame splintered from the earlier break-in. The intruder wasn't alone. Steeling myself, I hobbled toward the cabin. Max barked faintly from somewhere inside, a desperate sound that spurred me forward despite the dread curling in my chest. The interior was eerily quiet, the shadows thick and oppressive. I crept to the emergency kit by the fireplace, praying it was still there. My fingers fumbled with the latch, but relief washed over me when I found the flare gun inside. Before I could move, a floorboard creaked behind me. I spun around, the flare gun trembling in my hand. Two figures stood in the doorway to the living room, their faces obscured by scarves and hoods. One held a knife, the other a length of rope. "You're not getting away," the taller one said, their voice muffled but cold. Panic surged through me, and I aimed the flare gun. "Stay back," I shouted, though my voice cracked with fear. The shorter one lunged toward me, but I pulled the trigger. A brilliant flash of red light erupted, filling the room with a searing glow. The flare struck the wall, igniting a curtain, but the blinding light forced the two figures to stagger back, shielding their eyes. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. Grabbing Max by the collar, I bolted for the door, ignoring the pain in my ankle. The fire spread quickly, consuming the dry wood of the cabin. Outside, the storm raged on, the wind howling through the trees. I turned to look back at the house, its windows glowing with flickering orange light. And then I saw it, the snowman in the yard. Its blank face now seemed to watch me, even in the chaos. I took a step closer, my breath hitching. Something was wrong. Its head wasn't snow. The icy layers had melted slightly from the heat of the fire, revealing pale skin and lifeless eyes beneath. A human face. My scream was swallowed by the storm as I realized the horrifying truth. This wasn't just a game to them. It was a message. I had no idea where the neighbor's house was, only that it had to be somewhere down the winding road. The snow blurred the path, covering the footprints I'd made just moments before. My phone was dead, my flashlight gone, and the only sound besides the storm was Max's heavy breathing and the distant crackling of fire. After what felt like hours, a faint light appeared ahead, cutting through the blizzard like a beacon. A sob of relief escaped my throat, and I pushed myself harder, ignoring the searing pain in my leg. I reached the porch of a modest farmhouse, my knuckles raw as I banged on the door. "Help!" I cried. "Please, someone help." The door creaked open, revealing an older man with a weathered face and wide, startled eyes. "What in the—" he began, but I didn't let him finish. "Call the police," I gasped, collapsing into his entryway. "There are people at the cabin." They tried to. His wife appeared behind him, her expression turning from confusion to alarm as she took in my disheveled state. "Harold, get the phone," she said, pulling me inside. I stayed with Harold and his wife that night, but sleep was impossible. Every creak of their old farmhouse set my nerves on edge, and every shadow felt alive. In the morning, Harold told me something that sent fresh chills down my spine. "That cabin of yours," he said over a cup of coffee, "it's got a bit of history. Years ago, a family went missing there during a blizzard. Never found a trace of M. Locals say the place is cursed." The words lodged in my throat like a splinter. Could the intruders have been tied to that family somehow? Or was something even darker at play? I left town the next day, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every winter since, I feel like someone's still out there, watching me. I told myself it was all explainable. The tapping was a branch. Max was growling at shadows. The flickering lights were just the remnants of a dying electrical circuit. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Then came the knock at the door. It was late, past midnight, maybe closer to 1 a.m. The storm was still howling outside, and I wasn't expecting anyone, least of all in a snowstorm this bad. The sound was sharp and loud, cutting through the howling wind. 3 solid knocks. Knock, knock, knock. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Max barked, his deep, booming voice echoing through the cabin. Grabbing the flashlight and a heavy fire poker, I crept toward the door, my heart hammering in my chest. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky. There was a pause before a man's voice responded, muffled by the wind. "Hello? My car's stuck in the snow," he said. "I need help." Through the peephole, I saw him standing on the porch, bundled in a heavy coat and scarf, his face partially obscured by the snow blowing around him. His breath puffed out in short bursts, visible in the frigid air. "I'm alone," he added, as if reading my mind. "I just need a place to wait out the storm. Please." Every instinct in me screamed not to open the door. Something about his tone, too calm, too measured, set me on edge. And then there was the fact that no car tracks led to the cabin. If his car was stuck, how had he gotten here? "I'm sorry," I said, trying to sound firm. "I can't let you in. There's another cabin down the road. Maybe try there?" "Please," he insisted, his voice rising slightly. "It's freezing out here. I could die in this storm." I hesitated, gripping the fire poker tightly. But before I could respond, he added something that made my blood run cold. "I know you're alone." My breath caught in my throat. How could he know that? I hadn't said anything to suggest it. "Leave," I shouted, my voice trembling. "I'm calling the police." There was silence. Then, without another word, the man turned and walked back into the storm, disappearing into the white haze. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the door, trying to steady my breathing. My hands were shaking as I locked the door and slid the heavy wooden bolt into place. Max stayed by my side, his growls low and steady. I told myself it was over, that he was just some desperate traveler who had moved on. But when I finally mustered the courage to peek out the window, I saw them. Footprints in the snow. They weren't leading away from the cabin like I'd expected. Instead, they circled the house, overlapping and crisscrossing like a predator stalking its prey. My heart sank. He hadn't left. The man was still out there. The storm showed no signs of letting up, its ferocity rattling the cabin to its very foundation. The air inside felt heavier, colder, as if the storm had seeped through the walls and settled in the room with me. I sat by the fire, clutching Max's fur for comfort as he growled low and steady, staring at the window. That's when I heard it, the sound that made my skin crawl. It started faintly, just above me. Slow, deliberate footsteps. They creaked across the ceiling, moving from one side of the attic to the other. I froze, gripping the fire poker so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind raced. The cabin didn't even have a ladder to the attic. It was just a storage space, completely sealed off. "Who's there?" I shouted, though my voice trembled. The footsteps stopped abruptly, the silence more unsettling than the noise itself. I stood there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for anything to happen. But there was nothing. No response, no movement. Just the sound of the wind outside and my own ragged breathing. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I fumbled to unlock it. The screen lit up, but before I could dial, it went black. Dead. It had been fully charged an hour ago. Panic clawed at my chest as I rushed to the landline on the kitchen wall. Static. No dial tone, no connection, just a faint, crackling static that grew louder the longer I held the receiver. And then, faintly, I thought I heard something beneath the static. A voice? Whispering? I slammed the phone back onto its cradle, my heart pounding. "Stay calm," I muttered to myself, though the words felt hollow. Max let out a sharp bark, snapping my attention to the window. At first, I didn't see it, just the swirling snow and the darkness beyond. But then my eyes adjusted, and I noticed the shape. A snowman. It stood in the middle of the yard, its head tilted slightly as if looking directly at me. I hadn't built it. No one had been out there. The snow was undisturbed except for the footprints that circled the cabin earlier. My stomach twisted. The snowman hadn't been there when I looked outside an hour ago. I shut the curtains, the thin fabric doing little to block out the overwhelming sense of dread. I tried to distract myself, flipping through the books on the shelf in the corner of the room, hoping to find anything, to occupy my mind. That's when I found it, the photo. It was tucked between two old books, the edges worn and yellowed with age. The image showed a family, a man, a woman, and two children, standing in front of what looked like my cabin. They were smiling, but there was something off about their eyes. I turned the photo over, and my blood ran cold. Scrawled in jagged handwriting were the words, "We'll see you soon." My hands trembled as I dropped the photo, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I backed away from the bookshelf, my mind racing. Who were they? Why was this here? Max barked again, his hackles raised, and I felt the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, felt alive, like it was part of something watching, waiting. I couldn't stay in one spot any longer. I grabbed the flashlight and the fire poker, my heart pounding as I moved from room to room, checking every corner, every shadow. But no matter where I went, the feeling didn't leave. The sense of being watched was suffocating. I locked every window and door, though I knew it wouldn't matter if someone or something was already inside. The storm outside seemed to mock me, the wind howling like laughter. And then I heard it again, the footsteps. This time, they weren't in the attic. They were above me, moving down the hallway, slow and deliberate. Max barked furiously, his eyes fixed on the ceiling as the footsteps grew louder. I gripped the fire poker, my mind screaming for answers. How was this happening? As the storm raged on, I realized I was no longer just alone. I was trapped. The sound of the lock jiggling snapped me out of my daze. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. just a storm playing tricks on my ears. But then it came again, unmistakable. The faint, deliberate click of metal against metal. Someone was trying to pick the lock on the back door. Max growled low, his body tense as he faced the kitchen. I could barely move, every muscle in my body frozen with fear. The fire poker trembled in my hand as I stared at the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the cabin into complete darkness. The only illumination came from the faint glow of the moonlight, reflecting off the snow outside. My breathing grew shallow, my pulse thundering in my ears. I reached for the flashlight I'd left on the counter, fumbling with it in the dark. But before I could turn it on, I heard it, the soft creak of the back door opening. They were inside,